Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. I'm your host, James Azar. Thanks for tuning in. We have a extremely special episode today. It's a holistic look at cybersecurity, everything from workforce development to IoT to policy to risk management to CIS controls and threat actors. I've got an awesome guest. It's going to be an incredibly, absolutely great episode. I like to say incredibly, absolutely, and great a lot because it reminds me of 45. And I'm just kidding about that. Kayne McGladrey, the Director of Security and IT for Pensar Development and a member of IAAA, is going to be joining me on the episode today. We're going to be right back with Kayne, but before...
I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, GetSmartEye. That's GetSmartEye, like your eye, EYE.com. It's a new security company that's focused on your privacy. How many of you guys have eyes around watching your screens, your phones, your tablets? No matter where you are, it can be your own office, an airport, a train station, a co-working space, and even a coffee shop, right? But there's some documents and some information that really needs to stay away from prying eyes. That's where GetSmartEye comes in. They're using the latest biometric technology to give you complete control over the documents you send and who sees them. Whether you're viewing them yourself or sending them for someone else to view them, the GetSmartEye technology ensures that whoever's seeing it is the right person. And should someone who shouldn't see it grab a look at it, it gets the document to disappear and won't reopen it until it verifies the identity of the person you sent it to. So to get more information, go to getsmarteye.com/James. Again, that's getsmarteye.com/James. Again, getsmarteye.com/James.
Hey, thanks for being on the show today, man. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Me too, man. So I told you when I typically like to name my episodes, I didn't know what I really want to name this one yet. So the name's going to kind of come through. So people who will look at the name after as they listen, they go, oh, wow, cool. They're just going to figure out. You have a very, very interesting background of how you got into cybersecurity. I mean, share a little bit of that with us, please.
Well, before the show, you and I were talking about growing up, and I thought I was going to be an actor. So I was actually up till 12th grade, I was studying theater of all things. And it's actually not too unlike cybersecurity these days, especially because I've worked in sales roles before in cybersecurity. I've given presentations. And so I kind of look back at, I'm still acting occasionally in front of a large audience like I am today. But also that ability to think on my feet and to periodically improvise has really been necessary for succeeding as a consultant. I spent a lot of my time working with Fortune 500, Global 1,000 companies on about 3 different continents. Just last night in Seattle, we actually had a little earthquake. And it reminded me, it was a tiny earthquake, but it reminded me I was in Mexico City a few years back giving a training course in Spanish. I don't speak very well Spanish, and I've since forgotten it. And earthquake, power outage, and all right, show's going on. Let's go. Let's make it work. They're all fine. It's just normal earthquake. So, all right, this is what we do. But it's been a fun career. It's a great time to be in cyber.
It seems like cyber is attracting, we're going to get into workforce development in a second, and we'll talk about the lack of diversity in the workforce. But there's also a extreme diverse background of people that enter cybersecurity. So we may not have the gender and racial diversity that would be ideal like other industries, but the people who come into cyber are so diverse in their backgrounds, which is different from marketing or sales or IT or accounting. Everyone knows that one kid that you saw in high school that was really smart at math. This guy was going to be an accountant, and guess what they're doing today?
Right. I don't know. I'd say that in cybersecurity, we still have this tendency of proliferation of degrees and certifications that is making it kind of exclusionary for bringing additional people in. And one of the challenges you see, going back to Kaspersky's study on women and cybersecurity from last year, They found that a lot of women would not even bother applying for a cybersecurity job where they didn't meet the requirements. And so when you look at what an HR department puts out as a job description for a cybersecurity intern, where you need 17 years of Kali Linux and a Purple Heart and a Medal of Honor, they go, well, I don't meet that. So even though they might be very talented and have the aptitude necessary, the challenge I think we're facing is that people who they go, well, that's not me. I don't fit that mold perfectly. I think that's one of the challenges that industry needs to overcome. The people who are getting in, there is a lot of groupthink that our industry is succumbing to, and one of the advantages or challenges I like to look at. I've hired primarily veterans over the years. One of my
Thank
team
you
members,
for doing that.
it's the minimum thing that I can do. I could do so much more. One of the gentlemen I have on my team that I serve is a counterintelligence agent, and he really has reinforced in me the idea that if all of your analysts are green, you're getting owned really hard at that point. And I
Right.
think that in cybersecurity, that's what we have, because we've got people with diverse backgrounds coming from the same zip codes, going to the same schools, taking the same courses, talking the same language, and yet the financial impact is still shifting to the threat actors where they're making money off of this instead of us actually making progressive improvements.
So you bring up a few really, really good points, and as you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, I can pivot four different ways to this. I think the first pivot I want to talk about a little bit is I'll share with you something. I was in Tel Aviv, Israel, a few weeks ago for the Tel Aviv University Cyber Week. I took a delegation of CISOs with me, non-commercial, non-vendor CISOs. I'm talking practitioners, one of which was the Chief Information Security Officer for the state of North Carolina, a brilliant young woman by the name of Maria Thompson. Brilliant, brilliant. I mean, she was a Marine for 20 years and then joined the ranks of federal of state government. She has developed a partnership with the Army National Guard in North Carolina to align, defense with state operations and so forth, and has done an excellent job in her role. And she was invited to speak at a Women's in Cyber event at Tel Aviv University. So me and her, in the middle of our delegation, we were visiting part of our trip to Israel. We went and visited how Israeli companies operationalize cybersecurity. So we didn't do what a typical fly-in would be, which is let's go meet all these great vendors. And there's a tremendous amount of cybersecurity vendor talent in Israel, but you can sure bring those guys here and they'll meet with you for an opportunity. So we went to a Women in Cybersecurity event, which was held in a hall that seats about 200 people. There were about 60 or 70 people in the hall, of which 97% were women, 3% were men.
That's
And the
encouraging.
men was myself and the CEO of Cyber Reason and one other person from EY. That was it. Now, across the hall from us was a Israel France cybersecurity roundtable that was 98% men, 95% men, 5% women, but the women were handing out cocktails.
Mm-hmm.
Complete and absolute lack of diversity. I felt like this, and at the end of the whole event, which took about 3 hours, and only women spoke. I said, part of your challenge with doing women in cybersecurity breakout sessions or actual panels is that you're bringing women to talk about getting women involved. One of my suggestions was get 50% of your speakers to be women. And if you can't, then create topics around women, around cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And get those women involved, because that's how you're going to get more brain power in the room. See, when you're isolating them into a breakout room for 3 hours, you're not really promoting women within the industry.
Right.
You're saying we're an exclusive group that meets on the side. Instead, be part of everything that's going on. Make it look and seem normal to have that conversation. That's just, I know you have a daughter because we spoke before. and I have a daughter. And the one thing I say is I don't want my daughter going to a women-only event
Right.
because there's no need for her to be at a women-only event. She needs to be at an event that's dominated by men because that's where she's going to stand out.
Right.
That's how
Yeah.
you break through.
Yeah, I had a similar experience at a conference in Seattle that I attended a couple weeks ago. And I live tweeted it from the floor about primarily not the topics, because it was about all the same topics that we all get around and we all talk about the same buzzwords. And if you want to fill in your bingo card, you've got your AI, you've got your optimizing, you've got your automating, you've got a little bit of threat intelligence, right? Bingo at that point. My problem with it was not, yeah, this is all recycled content. My problem was I looked at the gender and racial markup of the people who were panelists, and they were doing a terrible job of showing that people in cybersecurity look different and sound different and might come from a different place on earth. And that was unfortunate because that combined with the imagery we use in the media, the beard optional man in a hoodie, really, I think, turns people away from cybersecurity, or they think, oh, like you said, you have to go to the breakout room, you have to go to the separate special area. No, we should have just one integrated workforce where we can collaborate together rather than having some schism or some split personality. Because unless we all really work together on this problem, it's going to continue the way it's going, which is the threat actors are making money off of people, and the vendors are clearly making money, but the people who suffer, this is not like a victimless crime. It's the companies, it's the individuals, it's the families, it's the consumers who are bearing this higher cost because of a lack of communications and a lack of diversity of thought.
So that kind of takes me to workforce development, and really, something that you and I think, share a passion for, which is you create diversity by really starting to address the work gap from a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
You make it more attractive so that Chris Roberts from Ativio Networks, Ativio, right? I'm saying it right. Ativo. I'm so sorry, Ativo. He will kill me at a later point, probably at Black Hat. If I disappear in the Vegas desert, I'm not part of the Hangover plot. It's because Chris and his beard have taken me someplace and made sure no one can find me. But he brought up a point where he says, we're sick of seeing all this imagery of guys in hoodies with no faces as being kind of the face of cybersecurity. And I completely agree with that. It was so evident when we went to different events during Cyber Week when he was in Israel. I spent a day and a half at the conference itself. And I say a day and a half, I really went Tuesday afternoon and I left Wednesday morning. After Netanyahu finished speaking, I pretty much got up and left. But the entire imagery on every presentation was a guy in a hoodie. Here's the threat actors. And when you look at workforce development, one of the things I always say is the threat actors look like you and me.
Uh-huh.
They look like Micah, my producer.
Yeah.
They look like Debbie down the street. They drive a Hyundai or a Toyota or a BMW. They wear jeans and t-shirts, maybe hoodies, and sometimes they even wear suits with ties.
True that.
They eat at restaurants, they go on vacations. And they also go to conferences and talk to you. They're looking at what you're doing. They're listening to what you say. They're taking the same certifications you're taking. And that kind of brings me to this point with workforce development and kind of the status of, all these great organizations out there like CompTIA and LPI and IC Squared and all these guys that are great ways to, we got to develop our workforce. But do you feel like we're putting too much out there to where we're building our workforce, no matter how diverse or undiverse it is, into one box of operation so that for the threat actors, it becomes much easier to kind of beat us at our own game?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I want to go a couple different ways with this. So to your first point as to whether or not knowledge sharing means that threat actors are able to also get the same knowledge as us as defense. Yeah, that's an occupational hazard. I think that accountants have that same problem, right? If they've got certified accounting exams that they have to take. Somebody who wants to go cook the books at Enron could take that and did take that same exam. They sat it, they had the same code of ethics, which they later broke. I think that the advantage of having that educational component is necessary. The trick is in getting folks to understand the cybersecurity is not all hands on keyboard. We need project managers. We need people in sales. We need people in leadership roles. We need people in tech support roles. It's not all red team, blue team. I know that red team is really shown as being the super attractive, fun stuff that we're not supposed to talk about. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge on conference stage. I'm not supposed to show you this, and then follow the Hollywood stunt hacking, and there we go. And everybody's supposed to be on the blue team. We need to move past that and make it into a more accessible career path where people see it as an industry rather than, and I mean, people outside of you and me and listeners to the podcast, but average folks should see this as a viable industry. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference. I want to say it was in Texas, and I met a woman there who was a custodian working in the stadium. And she didn't know what we were there for. And I got on to talking to her, and she had, two or three small kids in school. And probably the best conversation I had out of that conference was with this woman who had no idea what cybersecurity was. And we got on to talking about, what do our kids talk about? Well, our kids want to be rappers. They want to be maybe a lawyer. Maybe they want to be a police officer. But that's what they see based on what's being shown to them as being a normal career or a normal classification of job. There's no normalization of cybersecurity as, in media as being a career. Yes, we've got Mr. Robot. Yes, we've got the IT crowd or Silicon Valley. All of those are comedies except for Mr. Robot. Not really great marketing and getting it out there to the younger generations to help them understand, yeah, this is something people do for a living. I want to contrast that, though, against the event we're having in Bellingham this week, which is Gen Cyber, which is an NSA program.
Right.
If you asked me 10 years ago for me to say a kind word about the NSA, I might be, hard pressed to find something nice to say. They do good work. They have good analysts. They also have a massive workforce development problem ahead of them. And so what they've done here is kids, regardless of income level, I mean, there's no cost. It is an all-day camp for middle schoolers. It includes free lunch. We learned last night, actually, it includes a free Raspberry Pi that we can load Kali on later. And it's 5 days of intensive cybersecurity training with a really good curriculum. That's a visionary approach to breaking out of our current norms of who goes into cybersecurity roles, because there's that economics barrier to get in. You either have to take certifications, which are several $1,000s, or a degree, which, student loan debt doesn't get any cheaper these days. So I think that's really a great effort they're doing, and more companies need to look at that as a long game rather than short term. Well, we need somebody for our defensive tools and techniques for right now. No, we don't. We need a generation of learners who see this as an exciting, viable career opportunity to go into, rather than the status quo of doctor, lawyer, rapper, attorney, astronaut.
I didn't know that everyone can be a rapper, but I guess, I stopped listening to music when I started podcasting and started listening to more podcasts. I didn't know that was a career path. I guarantee you there's some university out there, want to be a rapper? Come and take our 8-month course at Trump University this year. I'm kidding. You kind of brought up Gen Cyber, and I agree with you. I'm part of a program right here in Georgia at the University of North Georgia, which for the NSA is one of the top 3 schools nationwide for it.
Mm-hmm.
Their Gen Cyber program is a month long.
Wow, that's even better.
And this year, I say this because 57% of the participants out of the 100 kids were girls.
Excellent. See, that's good marketing on their part. There's a reason they're putting puppies on Twitter.
Yeah, you would hope.
I hope. Yeah, I mean, they've had to really pivot on their marketing strategy and how they're imaging themselves to the American public.
But I also think part of that has to do with how local partners of the NSA, the universities that partner with the NSA, that get the NSA DHS designation and can run the Gen Cyber camps, how they market it locally within their community.
Mhm.
And a part of this at UNG is 50% of the staff in the cyber unit are women. So the researchers and some of the professors are women. So the women are going out to the middle schools and recruiting these kids. You're not sending just a man. And even though they've got great guys there from Ash to Dr. Payne, they also have women there that just absolutely get the job done. And I think that's also a big part of it. When you think of workforce development, also, one of the biggest challenges today is we have this job shortage. And that number ranges. I've seen 1 million, I've seen 3 million, I've seen 4 million. And I think that just depends on, I think those headlines are all clickbait. We live in a global economy. Cyber is a global challenge. It also requires a global solution. How much of these job gaps do you think are going to go to outsourced nations? No different than when we had the IT shortage, and a lot of that work went to the India, Philippines, Bangladesh, and other parts. How real is that really in cyber?
So I think that the regulatory climate, as well as the cloud hopper attacks in the past couple years, really are going to make that unattractive for most businesses. And if your listeners aren't familiar with the cloud hopper attacks, in a nutshell, threat actors were owning MSPs, managed service providers, and managed security services providers, MSSPs, and then pivoting downstream to attack their customers and their clientele through the MSP, because it's great. It's like, why rob one bank when you can rob the central bank and get access to all the banks? And that was kind of the logic that happened there. And then if you look at the increasing number of regulations that, especially like something like, I'm thinking like DFARS, ITAR, or the new CMMC out of the DoD, which is going to be live allegedly mid 2020, that's going to force, at least in the United States, onshoring initiatives. Australia and the UK have got similar initiatives on the cooker, as I'm told. And again, if you're in one of those affiliated manufacturing or DoD type industries, you don't have that as an option because you have to have citizens of your own country onshore doing that work. Beyond that, the question becomes an incentives question. Is an external entity going to have as much of a reward associated with securing a small business or medium-sized business's assets to warrant whatever fee they have, as opposed to potential damages that that firm could succumb to if they were owned? And that could come from something like an external breach that leads to ransomware, or that could come through an inadvertent disclosure of intellectual property, leading to either an export under trade control, or alternatively the PII, which then you get a regulatory fine associated with that. And that's kind of the maths that any company really needs to do these days. It's not just, hey, we need to buy this magic box and this box will secure us, and we just put it on the network and it goes beep and we're all happy. There's now really a legal consideration there that has to be part of that conversation.
I like what you brought up, and then that kind of brings me to the next thing, which is automation. So automation, you were talking earlier about your buzzword bingo at a conference.
AI.
Automation is a big buzzword bingo. How does automation solve? And is it practical to think that automation, let's say, can solve 25 to 30% of the workforce challenges?
I think that it helps, and not in the way we had intended it to help. So there's the way that there's an unfortunate trend right now with automation and AI that I want to bring up first. And it's the idea that if we have AI and we have automation, we need less staff. That is nonsense. That is patently untrue. And so for companies that are selling products and positioning that way in the marketplace, or people who think, I could have less staff, no, that's not a realistic viewpoint on the world. Where we get benefits from tooling like AI or automation is to retain people in cybersecurity careers. Somebody who comes on in a junior analyst or an analyst role does checklists all day. That's your job. It's you get an IR, you have to roll up, you have to do a full investigation. It's a checklist. If you're doing it right, at least it's probably a checklist. There is a process, and we're asking people to do something that most of that could be done automatically. Because what we need is the output of that analysis. We don't need the analysis process. If it's been well thought out, reading log files, reading alerts, doing event correlation, checking the SIM, checking your UBIS solution, checking your MFA logs, it all sucks time. More often than not, it results in a false positive. And so people who get into the industry go, this is boring. Like all day long, I do a checklist. Automate that. Have the people do what they do really well, which is things that require intuition or which will actually require a response or a decision to be made. I don't think we're at a point right now in human history where AI could be trusted to make a decision, despite what the SOAR platforms are saying. I mean, sometimes clearly with a SOAR platform, you can say, yeah, that's clearly an incident. We've got a known TTP there, right? Let's go ahead and roll up and do it. But for most of this stuff, have to set eyes on it. Computer showed you this analysis. Let's go check that work. But that's what I think our junior level analysts could move into. And then they can spend their time. And also, it's a force multiplier as well. Instead of triaging one incident or potential incident at a time, they can triage a dozen, look at the outcomes and go, oh, this is the red thread I need to pull on. Or actually, none of it's any good. I'm going to go work on programming now and on operations.
So you bring up a really good point, and that kind of wraps our discussion around workforce kind of really nice and neat, right? Because we've kind of covered it from almost every single aspect. But I feel like you brought up this last piece, which is taking our junior cybersecurity folks who are really kind of doing the mundane work and getting them cross trained to not only be bored all day long going through a checklist, but rather get them trained on in other things. And oftentimes on our podcast, um, we have people who are looking to get into cybersecurity that'll reach out and be like, "How do I get into cyber? How do I become a certified ethical hacker?" And I'm like, stop. You don't need to just be a certified ethical hacker. I go, it helps for you to know this. You don't need to have the certification. Take the prep course. You don't need to get certified. You need to know how to hack theoretically. You need to know how hackers would operate. What's their rules of engagement? How do they engage you? You need to know that. But you don't really need to know how to do it unless you want to be a career pen tester. Unless you
Right.
say, my whole path is I want to be a career pen tester, I want to break stuff that people build. Then, if you enjoy doing that, by all means, go. But if you really want to wear multiple hats, do the certified ethical hacking training. But go and understand how to do other things as well, from an analyst standpoint to uh, analyzing malware to reverse engineering to countermeasures to threat intelligence. You got to know all that stuff as well. We've got to create a more well-rounded workforce.
Completely agree. And I think that one of the things that's incumbent on organizations as they start looking at how are they going to do long-term workforce development is both looking internally for people who might have the aptitude, but not necessarily the certification soup and acronyms that are associated, to say, hey, you want to work on our team for a little bit and do IR? Or do you want to do pen testing, or do you want to like learn these skills on the side of your regular job, or maybe rotate into that duty for a little while? And then the other thing I'd say is for people who apply for these jobs and go, you know what, I didn't get the job, I wasn't qualified, ask what was missing off my resume? What was the thing that was missing? And would you be willing to consider me being an intern? And get that opportunity to get those learning skills instead of going, wow, I have to go take another certification. No, a lot of employers that, well, I think would be open to providing somebody that learning opportunity because it's going to lower their costs associated long term of hiring people.
True, but that also increases the risk,
It does.
right? I mean, hiring non-qualified people in security is a very high risk move. I think you as as you say you're a director of security and IT, but you're a CISO. I think you as a CISO of all people would know that when you hire someone who you're not sure can get the job done, you increase the likelihood of something really bad happening, and you're kind of taking responsibility for it. So from a risk management standpoint, how do you start kind of looking at automation and AI and bringing in interns and retraining and cross training? And how does that all come into your risk management framework? Because that's one part of risk that no one talks about: workforce.
So I'd say that they're not your first hire. That intern is not your first incident responder. They're not your first person who's going to do database security or Azure security. They are the person who can be mentored from that, assuming you have somebody and a workforce that is committed to mentoring and committing to teaching other people. And what I found with cybersecurity folks is we like talking about what we do to people who are interested, because more often than not, nobody wants to listen. Like it's just it's
Well, people want the cool stories.
boring. Yeah, exactly. They're
Yeah,
like
people
cool
want the cool
stories.
stories.
Yeah, but they might not want to do the hands-on. So you get somebody who wants to help you with your hands-on job. Yeah, can I move a little bit of my work to your desk and then see how it comes out? But it is a calculated risk. You are correct in there, and that you could end up with people who don't work out. But I'd posit that the risk of paying somebody 3 months' salary or 3 months' wages and then going, wow, it didn't work out, had to pay the recruiter fee, versus giving somebody a chance who has the aptitude and the desire, economically it makes sense, provided there's some guardrails around the data that they can access versus what they can't access.
When you look at risk management, and kind of now that we've kind of transitioned a bit into that,
Yeah.
there's a lot of different risk factors when assessing risk, and there's a lot of different risk frameworks today. A lot of them are coming up, some that have been around for a very long time. And I think there's a difference between risk and compliance.
Hmm.
People need to understand there's a difference between a risk framework to a compliance framework, and they don't always mesh up. How do you start kind of assessing the right risk framework for your business or your company? And then what are some of the common mistakes that we're doing when it comes to risk?
So I think that the challenge is right sizing the risk framework and then committing to it for a period of time. And I say that because something like Octave Allegro, which is out of CMU, is meant for very small to a small business, right? It's meant to be a very lightweight. It's not a very mathy framework. And then you go on the other end and look at something like, I don't know, FAIR, just as a for instance, right?
Right.
Very math heavy framework, very structured, very rigorous framework. I think that there's a tendency, at least among some CISOs, to go with the thing that's got like the hardcore math, the Excel spreadsheets, it's going to prove out by this formula, and it's cumbersome, and it's not fast, and it's not agile, and the time they spend actually cataloging risks is unfortunately takes longer than it should. And so really it's a question of what's your level of agility you need. If you're in business that doesn't have a risk management framework defined, don't go after the 800-pound gorilla of risk management framework, because everybody buys IBM. IBM is the safe buy, right? You remember that period of time. Don't go after that risk management framework just because it's the safe buy. Go with the thing that's appropriate to the size and speed of the business, and then iterate. Keep it around for a while. Keep it around for the 1 or 2 years, and then if it's not meeting the needs of your business, roll it up a notch. But don't say, oh, we need to start with this real hard process. By comparison, if you've got a process, are you following the process? If you go outside of the boardroom, outside of the director level, if you go out on the shop floor, the studio floor, or the retail floor, does somebody know how to file a risk? Do they know how to raise their hand and say, hey, I got a risk? Because if they don't, you need to stop and look at how are we educating the people we serve on how they communicate risk to us.
Do you feel like we're evaluating all of the different risk factors? Because I feel like whenever I speak to companies that either sell risk management solutions or have developed some sort of risk assessment, that they're kind of taking the big pillars, but they're ignoring a lot of the small foundational pieces that are required to really properly vet and understand risk. Where do you stand on that? Do you feel like do you feel like we're just so focused on data security and PCI compliance and HIPAA and our liability, and we're really ignoring a lot of the small stuff that really carries the highest risk?
See, and that's where you need to have that positive feedback loop with regular employees and members of an organization to submit risks, because you're describing regulatory risk. And if I talk to somebody in the sales org, they'll talk to me about sales pipeline funnel risk, right? Totally makes sense. If I talk to our insurance person, they'll talk to me about insurance risk. All of these are well known risks. The risks of the cybers are a little more, they're not as well defined either from an insurance perspective. We're trying from a regulatory perspective, but we're not there yet. There's no unifying theory, nor do I think there's going to be anytime soon. And that's because it's a dynamic risk that keeps changing. So the more eyes you have on it, the better informed you'll be. And that's why having both a GRC attitude or platform towards here's our regulatory risk, our sales risk, our insurance risk, all of the well-defined known risks. But also there needs to be that feedback loop. How do I say, hey, my computer's acting weird? Or, hey, I think that people can see through our windows and they might be able to see this cool thing that we're building. Is that a risk? And then there needs to be that process to actually not ignore them. Don't ever ignore people when they raise a risk. Process it, and then, apply controls or say, well, it's not a big risk. We're going to just ignore that risk. We're going to accept that risk.
One of the kind of technologies that's really raising every single risk red alarm is IoT. From the IoT headlines of so many billion devices being connected to the internet with no and little security to what just came out a few days ago with Google physically listening, having employees actually listen to recorded conversations on Google Home and analyzing them and categorizing them for better search engine results.
Mm-hmm.
How do we start addressing IoT and security? I mean, where do you even start?
So I think that this is a conversation that needs to be had around the dinner table at home. And I think it needs to be had around the board table. And
as long as there's no Alexa, Google Home, or Siri present.
I'm not sure about that. I have, I think 6+ smart speakers in my home right now so that I can assess the risks associated with them and figure out what's it like to live with this stuff. I can't go out and say, well, it's all bad unless I've actually seen what is this threat, what is this risk, and how can I implement compensatory controls. I think the tendency, though, right now is for companies to go, wow, we could sell this for money, and consumers to go, wow, that looks really neat, let's buy that. And that's how we get things like Hello Barbie or My Friend Kayla or the Fisher Price Smart Doll, all of which, Smart Teddy Bear, I should say, all of which spied on children. Or we get something like the last week, the Chinese manufacturer of IoT smart locks that had a insecure online repository of 2 million usernames and passwords for everyone's smart lock, as well as the time schedules of when those locks were open and closed. So if you're a burglar, you can take over somebody's smart home and you can know when they're not going to be home. So great time to do burglary, right? This is a fairly substantive risk. And because there's this assumption, because it's sold for money, it must be safe. And because maybe it's got a sticker that says secure on it, that companies must have actually done something around security. They often haven't. I think what's going on in the UK right now with the voluntary code of practice is a good first step where manufacturers, now it's still voluntary, mind, are going to say, hey, I am following this code of practice. I'm not going to have insecure authentication. I'm not going to have a poor supply chain management. Those are the considerations that on the manufacturing side we have to have. But unless people talk about this at home and decide, do I really need a curling iron with Bluetooth? Is this a good idea, right? I probably don't myself need one, but that's something I saw on the Twitters the other day, and I went, really? Who came up with this stuff, right? Which person?
Someone who thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, and that they could sell it for money, and there's no security built into it.
Do you feel? One of my predictions is that IoT is gonna hit the fan at around 2024, 2025.
That far out?
I think, and the reason I say that is because we still are unable to categorically be impacted by a privacy breach. Meaning people look at it and go, okay, I don't really care. Until we know that IoT kind of violation, the lack of security caused a national, and I hate to compare it, but a almost a 9/11 like incident, nothing will change it.
That's a
Because people
that's a scary viewpoint to take, but
but think about it. Let's do a recap of why I have a very logical reason.
okay.
Equifax, Home Depot,
Oh boy. Yeah.
Target. Name any one big company that's been through a breach. Chase, others. And Chase actually had victims in their crime because the hackers that stole that database went and did pump and dump schemes on their customers using
Right.
Chase as the median to do that.
Mhm.
So all these guys, all these different individuals and people don't really care when a breach happens because the impact isn't the same as something physically happening. So today we articulate as humans all over the world, not just in the US. It's also in Europe. People always argue that Europeans care more about privacy. As someone who spent a really good period, a really good part of my life in the EU and the Middle East, they don't really care. Their concept of privacy and our concept of privacy are very similar, but we articulate it differently.
Okay.
No one really cares because we're willing to give up. We've been sold the idea of giving up our privacy for free for the sake of getting something for free. And that's done through social media, YouTube, Gmail, Google search, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. We gladly sign away our privacy for the sake of being able to use that service for free.
That is
And that's
true.
why I think in IoT, the people who are in security, we're conscious. So when we go buy an IoT device, we're going to look at it, we're going to assess it, we're going to determine, can we secure it? Can it operate under a secure network within our home? And then use it. And we'll educate our kids.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
that's maybe 2% of the population.
Yeah. Exactly.
The other 98% doesn't care. And it's going to take something major for them to come around and then demand from their manufacturers when they buy a product to have a level of security. And it's not until the public asks for it that manufacturers actually do it and governments take action to enforce it.
So I think that there's probably another way of looking at this. And there's two things that come to mind right now. One is the California law that's coming into effect to not have default usernames and passwords to give us another Mirai. That was a direct response. Now, admittedly, in 2016, the internet had a really bad day when 1/3 of the internet was inaccessible because of people's hacked DVRs and IoT security cameras and other devices. California took the lead on that one and said, you know what, this is dumb. We can fix this through regulation. It was a good application. They didn't go far enough. I think that a control like that could hopefully avert a larger issue. The other one I'm watching really at a compliance level is the Jeep hacking case in Illinois set to go on
Mhm.
in October. Really looking forward to that because the threat of a manufacturer being sued as part of a class action for theoretical damages that did not occur might be a large enough impetus for them to look at securing certain types of IoT device. And a car, if it is in fact an IoT device, you've got a very kinetic threat model there, which is larger than you've got with a Nest Cam. Even though there was that event recently where a baby in a nursery, 7-month-old, some threat actor turned up the thermostat to 90 degrees and started swearing at the parents. That made the news. Did it drive change? Not so much, because there was no associated court issue. But does it look nasty? Yeah. Does it cause my friends and family to ask, hey, are these things secure? Should we have this stuff in our house? It's a good conversation, but I think that until there are enough legal penalties that build up, hopefully not in result of a large scale event, we're going to see this, this progression of horrors as the IoT garbage fire continues to burn.
So you bring up a very good point, which is you're saying what takes for change is either a big court ruling or a, like CCPA in California, and kind of the government coming in and twisting that in policy and regulation. I'm a very large proponent of less regulation. I think that the less regulation we have, the better. I've been feverishly against GDPR. I feel like what's going right now with GDPR, excuse me for my English, is a bunch of horseshit.
Uh-huh.
I feel like here we go. We're going to penalize British Airways 1.5% of their global revenue, $230 million, 184 million pounds,
Yep.
for being victims of a cyber breach where
Mm-hmm.
there was no negligence on their end. I'm all for penalizing organizations that are blatantly negligent in their security, meaning they repeatedly fail security audits.
Sure.
British did not fail a security audit. The British case was they had a hole in their supply chain, which is something a company like British Airways really shouldn't be held liable for. But because they're the bigger fish in the pan
Uh-huh.
and they're the ones with the money, that's what GDPR does. And it re-victimizes the victims. And here's the impact that I predict we will see because of GDPR in 4 or 5 years. The more companies that are fined, the less jobs that will exist because more companies will exit or hire less people or automate more or outsource or stop investing as much and go to friendlier jurisdictions to operate. And will do the bare minimum in that jurisdiction, but they'll start to diversify. I'm not saying British Airways will do that simply because they're an airline with the British mandate, but part of people from, I spoke to several people I know in England since this fine has been announced. If there was ever a chance for the UK not to leave the EU, that went to shreds and pieces with these GDPR fines that have happened in the last week, because more and more people go, these laws are going to cause us to lose jobs or lose raises. They may not downsize, but they may not give everyone a 4% cost of living raise. They may give them a 1% cost of living raise because the shareholders aren't going to pay this price. Employees and consumers will. We will pay more to fly with British.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on there, and we've seen companies that are regulatory compliant. Target was compliant with PCI DSS. They got owned, right? They got rolled up through a supply chain attack too. I think that regulation is going to drive some change. I also think there's an ethical aspect of this that members of professional societies really do need to go back and read the code of ethics that they subscribe to. So if you're a member of ISSA or ISC squared or IEEE or ACM or Computer Society, those 5 professional societies all have got safety, privacy, and security in their code of ethics. And I think that myself, I'm a member of 2 of those, the IEEE and ISC squared. I see it as our ethical obligation when we see a risk, like another TLDR policy, privacy policy that's going to take a consumer 10 minutes to read so that they accept manky terms of service that puts their data at risk, right? Somebody needs to raise that ethically and say, hey, this is a problem to consumer privacy. Or when you're developing another dodgy IoT device that's got no supply chain around your Kubernetes stack that you're importing, or whatever code base you're importing, the 80% of your code that's not yours that makes up your product, and you have no compensatory controls to check and see if anyone's owned that. Again, this is an ethics issue where individual contributors need to raise that risk, bring it to management's attention, and then even if they don't do anything about it, there's a document showing we accepted this risk, right? That's the sorts of things that's going to drive more change, whether it's either the board finally getting aware of the consequences of accepting these risks, or alternatively of regulatory or legal bodies finding that evidence and going, wait, they knew this was going to be a thing. They accepted this risk. They thought their cyber insurer was going to accept that. Beat them with a stick for that. Get them to change. because if we don't, there's no real incentive, because consumers keep buying cheap, poorly made, poorly secured, ill-conceived products. And it's not because consumers are stupid. It's not because the consumers are, cheap. It's because that's what's on the market. They're buying what's available. We as an industry, across a lot of industries now, as everything becomes software and data driven, we really need to look at how do we provide a better experience for everybody.
So I kind of want to give you a difference between the US and HIPAA and GDPR.
Okay.
It's in Washington, Primera Healthcare.
I
Very
know
big company.
Primera. Yep. I
This,
got
this,
that letter.
this morning, they got a $10.4 million fine across 30 different states. So 30 different attorney generals came together and did a settlement. It was led by Connecticut and the state of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
The settlement, and in their case, I don't know if you've read the entire piece of it. Primera was found to have known of their cyber vulnerabilities in 2014 by multiple, not only different security vendors, but multiple different companies that they brought into audit. And because they took no action, the fine that they got was $1 per patient. 10 million people impacted, $10.4 million fine.
Right.
Meanwhile, British Airways, GDPR in Europe, I think it was 500,000 people were impacted, £184 million fine.
Yeah,
The numbers,
it's not really a related number, is it?
no, not only is it not related, I personally think it's because they don't, the government there, they spend so much money on so much, they got to find a way to get more money, and they don't want to raise taxes because that doesn't get you elected, that doesn't keep you in office. So we're just going to pass a regulation where we can find the big companies, and it's easy enough and it's so broad, right? If GDPR said, if you get breached and it's because of your plain negligence, meaning you failed security audits, you don't have the right security controls in place, and defining those security controls to a minimum, meaning requiring a specific set of security controls, which they do, but it's very, very minimal. And
Uh-huh.
it's so minimal that anyone can do it. And they don't really create security. They're just have an antivirus, run a firewall, and have, use a VPN. Great. Everyone can do that, right? I
Right.
mean, that's not security controls. They don't do that. They rather created a very general regulation, I think, in a cash grab, in a European cash grab. My personal opinion, saying that, I mean, I say it all the time. I think GDPR is a EU cash grab because they can't tax people any higher. France taxes someone. I don't know if you know this or not. The tax rate in France is 70% for anyone who earns over 2 million euros a year.
I didn't
So
know
if
that.
you're successful in France and you're a French resident, you pay 70% tax on income over 2 million euros a year. 70%. And now France added a 3% global tax on all the major online companies. So if you're Facebook, if you're Google, if you're Microsoft,
Well, yeah, I heard something about that one. Yeah.
a 3% global revenue tax, not EU revenue, global revenue. At what point do people start understanding that all of this really does is all GDPR really is a cash grab? Because it doesn't really address privacy or
Yeah,
security.
yeah, we've seen breaches happen with that, but it's I think that a lot of these regulations are well intentioned, but perhaps not well informed, and they're ultimately a compromise. If the companies that were being attacked by threat actors were able to sufficiently implement technical controls and to feel it necessary to implement those technical controls and policy controls, administrative controls to train their people, we wouldn't be having these reactive policies and regulations be applied. So I think that as an industry, we can get ahead of this to prevent additional regulation if we choose to, But otherwise, that's what we're going to get, and it's going to be lobbyists who help write those policies and who help write those regulations, and that's what results in odd consequences like you're describing there. I'm not an economic policy analyst, so I can't really speak to where the money will eventually go. But now that we're seeing the scope of the fine, yeah, that is a large number. Totally agree with you on that one.
I mean, Marriott just got hit with I think it was 99 million pounds.
Yeah.
So the UK government this week made around, I think, what was it, 125 in dollars and another 230, $385 million this week. Not too bad. I mean, I think you and I and any company today would be extremely pleased with $385 million in net income in 1 week.
This is true.
And so I find that to be one of those where for the last about 18 months, I've been talking about how we're re-victimizing the victims of a cyber breach. Now, don't get me wrong, Equifax, it's been proven that they were negligent in the way they acted with cybersecurity. Not only should you fine them up the wazoo.
Yeah, I was hoping that one would be an extinction event for them, that they'd be done. And unfortunately, their stock price has gone up again. And
their stock price is back to it's actually higher than it was pre-breach.
Yeah, I know. And that's one where we are all involuntary products being sold by them, and there's no opt-out. That one just is so unfortunate. I mean, we thought the OPM breach was bad, right? In terms of PII getting owned by an APT, allegedly China, but nobody's for certain on that one, though those data haven't shown up. Equifax, same story, right? Someone out there is hoovering up a vast quantity of data about Americans and other citizens, like Canadians, other Five Eyes nations, collecting it, processing it, and sitting on it. And the companies that have been breached continue to exist. And like we've said with Equifax, they're getting better. And that's from a stock price perspective. But do they have they actually put in a control to prevent this happening again? Not necessarily.
And this is where I feel like there should be some sort of line in policy. If it's a state actor going after a multinational for the sake of either creating a difference in the marketplace for their own companies to come and fill a void or obtain data, we shouldn't be going after that victim, but rather we should be going after the state actor. And in the British Airway piece, it's been attributed to Iran. In Sony, it was attributed to North Korea, although, I heard the story, and I've heard the story from multiple different people. I tend to believe our intelligence agencies when saying that the Sony breach was an insider job that was sold to the North Koreans because the hackers who were, running the ransom that were trying to negotiate with Sony couldn't get any money out of the company. So then they gave it, the North Koreans paid them.
Yeah, I've heard the story.
Paid them for the breach and said, hey, well, what are hackers after? Money. They're not after, no one hacks Sony for the sake of hacking Sony. They want money. They go, hey, Sony, pay us pay us $3 million. We'll go away. Sony's like, no. All right. North Korea's like, we'll pay you $5 million. And it just happened to coincide with the stupid movie. Just happened to coincide.
That's true. But if you look at more recent stories, look at Mondelez and the current insurance Charlie Foxtrot that is, where because of attribution to Russia, Mondelez is probably not going to get a payout from Zurich, their cyber insurer, and now it's gone into court because it was an act of war. So now people who've got cyber insurance policies have to say, when they negotiate their next policy, to say, oh, it has to be an act of declared war, not just an act of war. And that's an unfortunate, and it's kind of an uncomfortable consequence of our current policy of U.S. Cybercom of naming and shaming. Because if you look at what naming and shaming has done for us, it's caused weird insurance problems. It sure hasn't shut down the nation states that are acting right now. And the only thing that's really come as a positive of it is when somebody goes from a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, they go on holiday to a country that does have an extradition policy with the United States. Yeah, they get rolled up. They get sent to Club Fed. But we could be quiet until then. this naming and shaming, I've yet to be convinced that it's got a real high value associated with it.
It doesn't. In fact, it creates notoriety. Notoriety. I'm sorry. It creates notoriety for the hackers themselves. There's I don't know of any other place where we shame someone who's accused of doing something publicly and get anything out of it. It doesn't happen, right?
Right.
This I was reading something that happened today. I don't know if you've read it or not, but Congress last night in a phone vote, in a non-in-person vote, which is very rare for this Congress to actually do and pass unanimously, passed a request to the White House to get the full directive that President Trump gave DoD on cyber, what they call forward defense,
Oh,
which is
okay.
essentially the hackback. So
Right.
Congress wants to see the full memo outlining everything the White House has given DoD permission to do, essentially indicating what you just brought up, an act of war. Because cyber is now becoming more of a and that paradigm was switched, and Congress is very, very smart, and this was bipartisan, by the way. So this has come from the Republican and Democrats alike. This is not a witch hunt. This is rather Congress saying, well, wait a minute. If you didn't launch missiles at Iran when Iran downed their drone, and instead you chose to go with a cyber attack, essentially crippling their entire missile infrastructure and command control, I've been told reliably by multiple people who I know in the intelligence agency that when we did that, the US flew multiple drones and aircrafts in Iranian airspace in an act of defiance to essentially say, we not only took down your missile controls and your air defenses, but now we're going to fly our drones right over Tehran and see you do something about that. And kind of a blatant, like, you can sit and watch, but you can't do anything about it because your enter button to launch isn't working. This has not been reported publicly. I've been told this by various people who have very good knowledge of that response. Congress actually annotates that in the request, saying because we've answered in a cyber way to a physical act of essentially war, you've shifted the paradigm from a missile attack to a cyber attack. Now Congress needs to start defining what is an act of war in the cyber realm. And we're entering, I think, a very interesting point in our politics where this is now bipartisan. It's very, very interesting. And it's only going to get more and more intense in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's, as cyber really does become the fifth domain, the paradigm used to be, if you bomb us, we will bomb you. And now it's, if you bomb us, we will drop an O-Day on you, and we're going to unleash the RMRF shark on you, like what happened with the GRU, like what happened with Iran recently. And you're right in that there's not been a lot of oversight over this program of defending forward. And I think that that's necessary because it's not like inside of the military complex, it's all just the military, right? There's contractors, there's ancillary systems that people work on that are non-military in nature. How do you constrain that collateral damage, right? We're not asking Target to put an anti-missile defense mechanism on their rooftops of their stores, but we are asking them, hey, can you put in a super defensive firewall and maintain this regulatory compliance? Because if there is an active cyber war against Target or Mondelez or another organization that's recently been a victim, we're asking them to defend themselves. And that's where I think that we at least have an opportunity to lead, where if we're going to make an attack in the fifth domain, specifically cyber, against a nation state that has, we've got enough evidence to say, yeah, pull the trigger or hit the enter key. How do we constrain who we hit? Because we don't want to go out and hit small businesses. We don't want to hit civilian targets in this. And the other risk associated with that, when we leave, you can drop a bomb, you can fire a bullet. It basically is destroyed on impact. That's kind of the intent. When you run a cyber weapon, anybody who's got any good skills on incident response, they get a copy of it. They can decompile that. They can figure out what you did, and then they can use that against you. Exactly. And I think we saw that potentially with Eternal Blue. because that looks like it leaked prior to its broad spread usage. So that's the other risk that we have at a policy level of how do we defend ourselves against our own cyber weaponry in our own days coming back on shore.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, which is instead of punishing the companies who are victims of state actors, our government's responsibility should be to help our companies be more secure and create a environment like no one punished United Airlines or American or Continental when 9/11 happened. No one fined the airlines for that crime. What did we do? We looked internally and said, as a government, we were too lax in our airport security and we created TSA.
Uh-huh.
My fear is that we're going to create a cyber cert force of sorts only after something really bad happens in cyber. And I'd like more practitioners to be the voice that says, how do we enhance private public government and private business relationships to not only information exchange, and CISA's doing a great job at starting to do that with Director Krebs. He's absolutely fantastic in a lot of the initiatives he's trying to establish.
Mhm.
But is it CISA's responsibility only? Where does Congress and Senate come in and say, as lawmakers, as people who want the economy to continue to thrive, as we want to really protect our citizens and our voters, we really need to kind of put tools and laws in the books to give organizations also a level of, I don't want to say immunity, but a level of legal freeway where you don't have to get a lawyer in the room every time the FBI comes to ask you a question or every time the Secret Service picks up the phone. It's been noted that when Equifax was breached and the FBI went in to interview them regarding the breach, they weren't allowed to speak to anyone from Equifax. Instead, they sat around and spoke to the attorneys from
Right.
King and Spalding about
Mhm.
the breach. So at what point do we say, let's stop this, folks. Let's get the lawyers out the room. Let's get these people in. Let's create a safe zone for this information to be shared from a legal basis. And that can only come from Congress and Senate. That can't come, from the FBI or Secret Service. We're a democratic republic. And as such, we need our elected officials to kind of foster and create that level field where a chief information security officer can pick up the phone and call his law enforcement counterpart and be like, this is what we're seeing. These are the problems we have, and have that legal protection where he doesn't have to do it in a place where he's calling them and being like, hypothetically speaking, if I see something like this,
Right.
what would you say, and well, we can't really talk about it more because if legal gets a hold of me picking up the phone and calling the FBI, I'm probably going to get fired.
Right. Yeah, I think that raises a really good point, and I think some of the people in government are looking to do this, and they mean well. Like if you look at what U.S. Cybercom is doing by burning implants by posting them to VirusTotal, right?
Right.
Great initiative. I love that they do that. Is there a similar way, like you say, for a CISO to do that in a non-recriminatory fashion that's not going to result in either regulatory action or legal action? Not really, not so much. But it comes to that question, like you say, what's that safe place? What is that communications mechanism for us to have a public-private partnership that doesn't carry a high degree of risk?
And that kind of brings up our threat actors, right? Because this kind of, I love how our conversation has kind of evolved. Because it's really, we've kind of gone full circle on this. Because how does government define threat actors? From a different, we know state actors hire other organizations within other nations to do their dirty work for them.
Mm-hmm.
China doesn't do all its hacking, neither does North Korea. In fact, it's widely known that North Korea doesn't even have a really good cyber offensive force. They're just, hired the Chinese and the Russian to do the dirty work for them. So how do we start kind of, addressing these threat actors, and who should we really be paying attention towards?
That's a really, really broad question. So I'd say that the idea behind a threat actor is, who is your threat actor? I think that's really the first question that everybody has to be able to ask, because threat actor itself is too broad of a term. And there's this tendency in industry, in the cybersecurity industry, to say, oh, there's threat intelligence. I can get a feed of, no, you can't. You need it tailored to who is your threat actor. Do we need to have a legal definition of a threat actor? Boy, that'd be favorite. That'd be great if we could put that term on the books, like we put the term breach nearly on the books, to define this. These are the key characteristics, and here's how you can come up with a commensurate response. But we haven't got that yet. I think this goes again to the challenge when I think from an insurance perspective, which very frequently I find myself really enjoying insurance publications, is we've had the cybers for only, 30, 40 years to the outside. Really, we've had the cybersecurity maybe 20 years. You could say 30 years for viruses. There's not a well-defined risk model yet. There's not these hard definitions that will allow us to say this nation state is a threat actor, or they're employing a threat actor because this happened, and here's the appropriate response. We're getting there, but we're not there.
You feel like if we do get there with threat actors, that the idea of defining them, and you talked about naming and shaming, the idea of would be able to go after them would be easier?
Attribution is hard, especially in the world of false flags that we currently have. And that's where you really have to have a high degree of confidence. So, like, if the NSA or the FBI, they say, hey, they did it, I've got a really high degree of confidence that they're probably right most of the time. You'll notice how I'm couching my language. Can an individual...
You're doing it very well, by the way. You're doing it very well, Kayne.
Can an organization do that, right? Can a Fortune 500 company do the same work as they do at the agency, as they do out in Langley? No. Are they doing the same work? Or do they have the same type of skill set that they have at Fort Meade? No, they don't. And that's where it becomes very hard for an individual organization to say, well, we knew that they did it. No, you've got maybe it's like some shadows and fog that indicate who attacked you. But unless we get like a hackback type law on the books that authorizes that, which is going to be a Wild West Charlie Foxtrot, unless we get that, it's really, how do I prevent against the next one of this? How did I detect this faster? Who actually is the most likely candidate that did the attack, and what are their known TTPs, their tools, tactics, and procedures that they use? How can I better defend and remediate that, rather than trying to figure out how do I, as the owner of a Fortune 1000 company, how do I go take vengeance on them? Good luck with that, right? Trying to bring your cybers against their cybers, not worthwhile to go do.
I want to say thank you for coming. I'm having so much fun in this conversation. I've stopped noticing time, and I do have to respect your time. So I want to ask you one final question before we sign off. What
Okay.
are some of your best practices as someone who's in security?
So I think it's impossible to defend what you can't see. And that's a real failure in the cybersecurity industry, is to miss that key idea. If you don't know what your assets are, you can't identify an implant. If you don't know what your realistic software is, what your normal software is, you can't detect malware, not effectively. You can't detect unauthorized usage patterns. So really, you need to know what you have, and also you need to know what your users have in terms of who they are and what they can do. So much of what we've seen, especially in the medical industry, is around unintentional disclosures of data because the employee had access to something that they were given access to as part of their job that they shouldn't have had access to. Or we have the additive privileges where people continue to have access and they can write to their USB disk and oops, it went missing. Right? By just focusing on who has access to what, kind of the old Cluedo board game, Mr. Plum in the library with the lead pipe. If you can't answer that basic question of who has access to what, when, honestly, the rest of your cyber hygiene program is sure interesting and it's nice window dressing, but it's going to get owned.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Kayne. I really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back on if you'll say yes again.
I will.
Maybe we can plan something out when I'm on the West Coast and we can do this face to face with some espresso. Yes, espresso.
That'd be fantastic.
And because you're in just outside of Seattle, home Starbucks. We can. I'm sure there's a ton of coffee shops that make Trump Starbucks in that area. So I can't wait.
Ever so many. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been informative. It's been illuminating. I've really had a good time.
Me too. Thank you so much for coming on. You have been a breath of fresh air. Like I said, just absolutely great. I loved where we went with this conversation. Probably the most unfocused podcast I've ever done, but probably the most information anyone would ever get out of it. I really appreciate it. If you're listening, stay tuned. We're going to be back with more right after this message. Kayne, thanks for being on the show. I really do appreciate it.